Okay friends, so back with our fondant here. So you can see the fondant that I made has set up really nice. It's really smooth, nice and pliable, but not sticky. So I'm just going to show you a few basic things. To start with, I'm just going to give you an example of how you would cover a cake. Now, if you were covering a cake, you would want to make sure that your fondant has had several hours to set up, because when fondant is fresh, it tends to overstretch, and you don't want your fondant over the top of the cake to overstretch and end up pooling at the bottom. So let it set for several hours before you would try to cover a cake. I'm going to use just a tad of powdered sugar to keep my fondant from sticking to the counter. You can brush excess fondant off of the top using like a brush. Don't try to wipe it off with a damp cloth or something, because you're going to make your fondant surface sticky and it will become glossy, which is fine if that's the look you're going for, is glossy, but most of the time we want a nice flat finish on our fondant. So I'm just going to use a rolling pin, and I'm going to, since I'm doing a round covering, I'm going to try and keep this as close to round as possible. So I'm just going to rotate. I would constantly check and make sure you're not sticking to your counter surface, because pulling sticked fondant off of the counter is a pain, and you don't want to have to do that. So I'm just going to get this so that it's large enough to cover most of the cake I'm covering. Make sure your piece of fondant is going to be big enough. So just for the sake of showing how to cover, I'm just going to use this little cup here, and I'm just going to drape this over the top. Now you can see this does not reach the bottom. That's okay. When we cover with fondant, it has some stretch that we're going to use to our advantage. So the first thing you would do is you would smooth the top, make sure there's no air bubbles underneath. You can do this with your hands, or you can use a fondant smoother. I prefer to use my hands because I like to know what I'm doing and feeling. Now, when we're covering something that's round, we're going to use that stretch to conform to the round shape instead of creating creases. What some people have a tendency to do is they fold it down, and then you end up with these creases that you have to try to patch. You can stretch fondant so that it will fit to the shape without having all of those excess seams. So you just very gently, using a downward motion, you're stretching that fondant so that it comes down the sides very gently. The heat from your hand is going to cause it to stretch. If this was cake, we would also, remember, need to be very careful so we're not putting dents in our cake. But as you can see, as I'm going around, it's becoming longer and getting closer to the bottom, or sitting on the bottom. If you were doing a cake, turntable is a key piece because you can constantly be rotating. So you can see what's happening here is it's stretching very nicely to the bottom, and we just keep going very gently. This is also why it's really important to not do this with fresh fondant, because this overstretching that might happen with fresh fondant is it would cause it to tear, and we don't want that. So you can see I've got almost to the bottom all the way around here just by stretching. So once I've got it all the way down, what I'm going to look for now is to see if I can get all the way around without having any places where it's overlapping now and still buckling, because I don't want to have seams. So it'll kind of start to look like a ghost where it's kind of pushing out, and what we'll do is we'll trim that off. Okay. So once we get to where it's all the way smoothly down the sides and there's no more overlap, all that overlap has now been pushed out. Make sure your sides are nice and smooth and touching. There's no air bubbles underneath. All the way down, just like that. And then we're going to take a knife, and we're just going to come in at an angle and cut off that excess at the base. Okay, so I've cut off all of that extra bit, and then I'm just going to come back around again Make sure that it's still hugging the sides, okay? So now, if you're doing a border around the bottom, these little jagged edges aren't going to be a big deal. Usually we put some kind of border around. If you're wanting a clean side with no borders, then you would want to be more precise with your cutting to make sure you get a nice smooth line. Typically, I put some kind of either ribbon or something around the bottom, or I pipe with buttercream around the base because it's a little bit easier than having to make sure we have a really perfectly clean cut around the edge. But so that's it. You can see it's nice and hugged. I don't have any overlapping seams because I was very gentle in how I smoothed that fondant down. Okay, so I didn't have to have any creases. It's all nice and smoothly covered, just like that. Okay, so that's exactly what you would do with a cake. This is just on a smaller scale. I would recommend practicing on something like this, the lid of a water bottle or an upside down cylinder cup, something so that you can practice that technique of smoothing out the bubbles and getting all of that excess piece pushed out before you try to cover an actual cake, because a cake is going to be a lot softer. It's going to have more give, and so it's a little bit harder to get that smoothness. And so practicing on something that's a little bit firm first, so you understand that technique and how it's supposed to feel, is going to make your outcome of your first covered cake a whole lot easier. All right? So that's the first thing for you to work on and practice.